indigenous rights, environmental justice, on and on and on. So on some level, this panel is a real model of the kind of quilting that this conference is really trying to sort of focus on. And I'm really excited about this group of panelists because I think that they are really going to find different points of connection that maybe they hadn't even anticipated, and I think we all will as well. I just wanted to say very briefly, there are a whole lot of other issues, of course, we could be talking about. If I weren't the moderator, I'd probably be talking about LGBT sort of solidarity issues, because obviously around the world, you know, that's a pressing issue, and there's so many others. So I think that we're going to learn a lot from our panelists. Each one of them is going to speak for 5 minutes, and essentially I won't ask questions. They will speak to you for 5 minutes, and then after each one has spoken, I will probably ask a few questions before opening it up to the audience, but we really should have ample time for discussion. I think probably about 20 minutes. The panelists will be, actually the first speaker will be Nadine Nabir. Nadine Nabir is a cultural anthropologist. She's a professor here at the University of Illinois at Chicago in Gender and Women's Studies and Asian American Studies, a long-time Arab American activist, women's rights activist. She's the author of a book called Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism. She's also a co-founder and a member of the advisory board of many, many, many groups, so I'm not going to list them all, but I will list a few. Arab Women's Solidarity Association, Arab Movement of Women Arising for Justice, and the Arab Women's Activist Network. So I think I'm going to stop there with my introduction, and Nadine, welcome.
Thank you, Lynette. I'm honored to be part of this panel with these incredible, inspiring people. And thank you for all coming. I'm just going to get right into it because of time. So working with U.S. women of color movements and also Arab liberation movements, I've constantly been running up against this similar problem where there is a separation in the way we organize in the United States, where we think of international solidarity as if we're talking about these regions that are separated from the US. And the movements are also framed separately. When we do anti-war work, it's as if they're the anti-war movements on the one hand, and then the racial justice, you know, then the domestic issues are these other movements, racial justice, indigenous, decolonization, immigrant rights. So what I want to do today is just try to get at in 5 minutes what we actually mean when we say transnational movements. How can we actually think about the term, that's the title of this panel, to think about the connections across borders in the work that we do. So I'm going to start with a couple examples. The first is the case of our beloved Palestinian activist Rasmiya Youssef Odeh. Starting in 1969, she was in Israeli prison for 10 years. She was sexually and mentally tortured into a confession. She was convicted in an Israeli military court under a system with a 100% conviction rate of colonized Palestinians. And now she's 66 years old. She's been in Chicago for 20 years. She's a citizen. And now she's being charged. She was arrested. And the US government is now accusing her for immigration fraud based on naturalization papers she filed 20 years ago. So it's so obvious that this is a political attack using an immigration, immigration argument case about immigration fraud to target her because she's a Palestinian and an activist. And they're also, she is facing potentially 10 years in prison and $250,000 in fines. And they're bringing in her history of activism in Palestine into her case that's about the immigration fraud in Detroit coming up in October. And by the way, I have a petition that I'd like all of you to sign to free Rasmiya. So if someone could maybe just grab this and pass it around, I'd appreciate it. So number two, during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006, the Israelis killed 1,200 Lebanese, wounded 4,000, and displaced 1 million. At the same time that that happened, in Detroit, Michigan, you had a targeting of people from South Lebanon, from the village that were targeted in Lebanon. They targeted people in greater Detroit who were from those villages. So when they went to the streets to call for ceasefire, they were being criminalized as terrorists. And so what I'm trying to show here is how we can't separate what's happening abroad from what's happening in the United States. And this didn't start after September 11th. In 1972, the FBI spied on Arab Americans after the '67 war. The LA 8 case of 1987, because of time I won't go into that history, but I do want to say that U.S. imperialism also means, as we know, that U.S. police and prisons share military technology. Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, the organization, works on how U.S. police use weapons that shoot and kill unarmed women, children of color, and police can remotely administer shock to detainees. Drone manufacturers may end up offering police remote-controlled drones. So we know a lot about this, and Angela Davis, writing on U.S. women's prisons, has used the word, said, what if we named U.S. women's prisons as secret prisons? So why did she use the word secret prisons? Well, she's referring to the CIA's secret prisons in the war on terror in places like Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, and Morocco, where suspected enemy combatants are tortured, sexually assaulted, and raped, and individuals are tortured by U.S. personnel at detention facilities directed by the CIA or foreign agents within jails assisted by the CIA. And we also know that U.S. police train in Israel. They're trained by the Israeli army. So the military, we also know as activists in the US that the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex both expanded out of privatization and have a history in the war on drugs. And both are driven by the economic neoliberalism of the late 20th and beginning of the 21st centuries. So what I want to say then is that racism, racial policies, racial violence, and racial profiling in the United States are not impacts of US imperialism. They're not coincidences of US imperialism. US racial violence in the United States is war. It is war. They are war. They are imperialism. Yet even our movements like the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, even that movement which I'm part of, the movement that's for boycotting, divestment, and sanctions of Israel, even that movement remains focused abroad. So that movement has put so much energy into focusing on ending Israeli colonization of Palestine, but it doesn't connect so well with the way that Zionism operates in the United States. So that we need to be working on all those fronts because so what I want to say about the BDS movement is we need to determine how to challenge the US not only as a supporter of Israel, but as a key location of Zionism and Israel itself. Israel is founded on settler colonialism and racism, and it found its perfect home in the US settler colonialist state. Our national liberation struggles and struggles over colonized land here cannot be framed as bound by the territories of nation states. So when we bring our movements together, and I'm just going to go a little bit to the end now, when we try to connect our movements, we also have to be careful not to think of our struggles as equal. So just because we're connecting, let's say, the prison abolition movement with the anti-war movement, it doesn't mean that the people are facing equal forms of violence. But that's the tricky part. How do you keep alive those connections, but also keep alive an analysis and addressing the asymmetries in the balance of power? So how do you deal with, let's say, the issue of military recruitment in working class communities of color and of women of color, knowing that women of color are going to face increased rates of rape and sexual assault in U.S. prison and men of color will be placed on the front lines? How do we deal with that while simultaneously thinking about the Iraqi women who are on the other side of the bombs and the bulldozers? we're not saying that they're equal struggles, but then how do we do that in a transnational movement? That's a question I have. So let me just give a couple examples of movements that have time. Okay, I was going to give you examples of movements that have tried to do that, but we can do that later. Can I end with 1 minute?
Yeah.
Let me just end by saying that when I'm talking a lot about very extreme forms of violence, killing, bulldozers, death, but what happens when our communities face such extreme forms of urgent violence? Two things. One, we get an intensification of sexism and heteropatriarchal family structures in our own communities and sexual violence. That also doesn't get addressed because we say people are dying. We can't talk about gender, sexuality, and homophobia and transphobia because people are dying in Palestine. So I want to also bring that to the table, that when we think about freedom, we need to think about the types of visions for our community that can deal with the multiplicity of oppressions and all the variations so that we can be committed to keeping all people alive. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. I actually didn't tell you the order of speakers, so let me do that now. After Nadine, we're going to hear from Prexy Nesbitt, and then we're going to hear from Walter Riley, Christo Lehman, Andy Clarnell, and then Lisa Brock. So that's going to be the order of speakers. Next, we'll hear from Prexy Nesbitt. Prexy Nesbitt is a longtime Chicago activist. He's been actively engaged in various solidarity movements in Africa since the 1960s. He was a leader of the anti-apartheid struggle here in Chicago. He was actually a member of Frelimo, and he can explain that, in the 1970s. And he was also part of ACOL and many, many other organizations. He's currently working, I'm sorry, and this is a brand new network, US Africa Network, and so he'll talk a bit about that work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There used to be a person that you all know named Amilcar Cabral. And Cabral had a wonderful way of talking with any audience. I had the great pleasure to work a great deal with him. And I was there in 1971 in London once when he was speaking, and he, West Indian brother in the audience, said, Brother Cabral, you haven't recognized me. You've recognized all of these young white British students, but I'm here from the West Indies. You haven't recognized me. And Cabral looked at him and he kind of smiled and he said, Comrade, I greet you as a comrade, not as a brother. He said, if I greet you as a brother, I don't recognize then the historical responsibility and commitment that we have for each other. But when I greet you as a comrade, I bestow upon you and you upon me a historical responsibility and commitment. And that's the way I feel about this whole conference. The vision of freedom I have is a global situation where poverty, racism, militarism have been ended. There can be no freedom in a world like we have today, made even more grave by the announcements in today's newspapers, where the U.S. military is involved with more than 90% of Africa's 54 nations. It is called publicly a small footprint by U.S. military forces and commanders. But the officers running the secret wars say Africa is the battlefield of tomorrow today. Africa is the battlefield of tomorrow today. The organizing I'm currently doing is with the U.S. Africa Network, formed only a year ago, given the void of progressive national leadership on Africa questions in this country. The non-functionality of Trans-Africa or Trans-Africa Forum, the non-functionality of what was called Africa Action. A group of us met and formed U.S. Africa network to try to begin to address this void in this country that has existed since the South African regime was ended and the ANC came to power in South Africa in the elections of '94. Thus, the foci of our organizing is to end U.S. militarism on the African continent, which is growing, as I'm saying. Teleconferencing, educating, mobilizing, demonstrations against entities like AFRICOM, which is the functional term for all U.S. military work that is increasing on the African continent. We have a big upcoming action, a countering presence to the Obama Summit Conference on Africa taking place in Washington, August 4th. We are creating what we call the Empower Africa Dialogue. That is a counter to Obama's summit where he's bringing these African leaders to Washington, D.C. The network works also on other issues like climate justice, for example. And it works with selected African countries, but with civil society in those countries, like in Nigeria and in South Africa. And we work under the mantra, same struggle, many fronts. In the current situation, there are a multiplicity of interrelated struggles that are taking place. In our organizing, the U.S. Africa Network operates on a principled basis as an intergenerational, transnational, multiracial, non-hierarchical, and transparent struggle entity. Many struggles, many struggling, often the same enemies. I think that one of the things that I'm most happy about in this work with this new organization, I'm happy to entertain any number of questions about it, is that it is made up of multiple peoples, various generations, doing various political work, and then in one arena we all work together is in solidarity with similar groupings of people coming from a wide variety of African countries. And I think that part of that meets my own understandings of solidarity, which were formed and shaped in places like Mozambique, and in Angola, in Namibia, in the struggle in South Africa, and started out in Tanzania. And one of the things that I think comes out of all of this is what I call multiple solidarities. I don't know any other way that we can do solidarity work, particularly global solidarity work, except in the way of doing multiple solidarities. In this, I take my cues very much from the example provided by the old Mozambique, because they succeeded in destroying the old Mozambique. But the old Mozambique in 1964 and 65 until about 73 was a country that just was a home of multiple solidarities. It wasn't just solidarity work it did with Zimbabwe and literally supporting the armed struggle of the Zimbabwean people. It wasn't just that it hosted also the ANC of South Africa. It also opened its doors, its people opened their hearts and their engagement to people coming from Chile, for example, immediately after the coup in Chile, to people coming also and people involved in East Timor. And so they taught me the concept of multiple solidarity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prexy. Our next speaker is Walter Riley, another longtime activist from his involvement in the civil rights movement, his work as a field officer with CORE, his involvement in field secretary, sorry, with CORE, his anti-war activism, involvement with SDS, and I could go on and on. His current work is with the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund, and also the Haitian Action Committee.
Thank you. It's very excited to be here and to be part of this discussion. Coming from the West Coast, we don't have this kind of gathering in the same way here, and thank you, Barbara, for inviting me. I'm also happy that I'm following Nesbitt, because I have been following him for most of my life.
Prexy.
Prexy.
It's all right, it's a horrible name. If you think about sexy, and then you come up with Prexy.
Sexy Prexy.
There you go.
In the anti-apartheid movement, in the solidarity movement, in so many different places. So that it's to some extent informed by his wisdom that I have been involved around Haiti. That is not my current work. My current work is as a anti-police misconduct, police brutality activist and a lawyer. My waking hours is primarily spent around community organizing in Oakland and doing political work on that level. But I do work around solidarity with Haiti. The Haiti Action Committee is one of the groups that we work with. And in 2004, I was principal in founding the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund, which's name got copied a lot after the last earthquake in Haiti. But the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund was founded in order to support the folks that were being rounded up and taken to various places by the U.S. military, by the Haitian coup, and with the support of the UN. We helped people politically, and we raised money from the community. We support people who are engaged in political struggle. We help people survive who are organizing in Haiti. We help people organize in hiding. And we didn't want to take money from people that we had to explain where we were giving the money to. So it is that kind of organization, the political organization. And we talk about walking with folks and not solidarity in the same way, because there's a political discussion around what solidarity is. We have been part of the support for the solidarity in the movements in Africa, particularly in South Africa, building those ties, but in South America. But in Haiti, the struggle is fairly different than I think we have experienced to some extent in the progressive movement, and particularly in the left movement in the U.S., particularly among black activists. We don't pay enough attention to the details of what's going on in Haiti. I think that in large part, much of the progressive movement won't pay enough of attention to it because it's like black on black. It's like the problems of after apartheid. We didn't pay attention to South Africa because it was black people that were doing the oppressing. And that, to a large extent, is true in Haiti, except they're paid by the U.S., they're paid by the Western imperialists. But Haiti is the only country, the Haitians are the only people in the world that have ever freed themselves from slavery. And historically, that's particularly important. It's also the place where the U.S. and the Western allies basically decided they would not allow this country to be free, would not allow an advancement. Wow, 2 minutes. Right now, the struggle in Haiti for us that we need to pay attention to is who is doing what, who is being paid by who, and what kind of support they're getting. And it's not just to pay attention to what the Western allies, U.S., France, and Canada are doing, but to pay attention to what we're doing here in the U.S. And I think a big problem that we have right now is that we don't discuss it and talk about those differences within the progressive movement and the left movement, because too many progressives in the United States are supporting people from Haiti who have progressive rhetoric, but are also involved in killing people in Haiti. I have friends that we work with. Kali is part of this movement, and he's shaking his head and understands. We know people that daily are being attacked by folks who are supported by USAID, who are being paid as part of some NGO movement. But people come here, and they do left rhetoric, and we invite them to be part of our conferences. And we don't talk about it. They were part of the U.S. Social Forum, people who are killing our friends. In Haiti, the struggle is not one of workers trying to take state power to establish socialism, so we don't pay close attention to that. But it's people fighting for reform, fighting to have better schools, fighting to have health care, and fighting to have decent housing, clean water. Basic kinds of issues that help them to survive, they help them to build a better life. But if we can keep that going, we can reach a point where people have space to make fundamental changes in their lives and in their communities. If we can keep the organizers going, they can give leadership to struggles in various parts of Haiti around agrarian reform. If they can get irrigation in the farmlands, if they can get health care in the boondocks, if they can get radio stations in the boondocks, if they could avoid having the U.S. come and take over their hospitals and take over the institutions. What we do in Haiti, the Haiti Emergency Relief Fund and Haiti Action Committee in alliance with folks in Canada and other parts of the world, we try and support the democratic movement of Lavalas. That is the folks that the U.S. government does not want in power. The last election was a selection by Hillary Clinton. She went to Haiti. The election commission said they didn't have a candidate. The candidates that people had voted for hadn't clearly established the majority that the election commission wanted. Hillary Clinton had two choices. She went there and she said, I'm going to select Martelly, and you have to vote for him or you don't get any other kinds of support from us. And the election commission said, well, he wasn't elected. They said, but you're going to have to report him out. And they did. And he is the president. And he is the most vile kind of president in Haiti, ushering in the dictatorship, providing red cards and pink cards for people, the same as Baby Doc did, to allow people to be killed. The struggle right now is to understand who to support and who to listen to when they come here to make reports about what's happening in Haiti. Lavalas can be clearly found if you look for the internet. I support, the Haiti Action Committee support, and her supports Aristide as the leader of the free movement, the democratic movement in Haiti, the only movement that has allowed the vast majority of people to participate in the struggle for their own lives, decision making.
All right.
No, thank you, Walter. Okay, our next speaker is Crystal Lehman. Lisa, you're looking at me, but you said you wanted to be last.
I didn't say I wanted to be last, but that's okay.
Lisa Lehman is a member of the Beaver...
Crystal.
I'm sorry. Krista is a member of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation in Alberta, Canada. She works with the Canadian Indigenous tar sands and the Sierra Prairie chapter. She's engaged in activism and solidarity work around environmental justice and the rights of indigenous peoples, with her major focus being on the destructive impact of the exploitation of tar sands, exploiting these sort of life worlds of First Nation people in Canada. She recently attended the United Nations Rio 20 conference on sustainability and has been involved in many other gatherings that really connect her grassroots activism with global sort of solidarity work. So, Crystal?
I don't think my teacher voice will carry that far. I'm also a teacher. Niasen, una pitaki sagaw kakio, squahtamik, utse, wasagam, misko, kawi squahtamik. Good afternoon from the doorway in to the doorway out. Nia Crystal Lehman, a misk sagahikan, Treaty 6. Crystal Lehman, Beaver Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6. The first thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge territory of the Sac and Fox, Miami, Squagi, and Watau Watmi of what is now Chicago. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to, pardon me?
I was just going to hear. Can't hear you. She wants you to repeat that.
Okay. I just acknowledged the original peoples of this territory. So breaking down this preconceived idea that our capacity is limited by borders, we all have one thing in common, because no matter race, color, or creed, there's one thing that connects each and every one of us, and that's water. that gives life. Environmental destruction and environmental racism is no longer an Indian problem. If you breathe air and you drink water, this is about you. Extreme resource extraction, industrialization, development, climate change, wherever you are, one or all of these is your problem. We don't have time to debate anymore on whose trials and tribulations are worse and or more important. This world we are living in, controlled by the 2%, is coming down on us with the brass hand, making willfully ignorant decisions that have real human life consequence. We don't have time to debate, nor do we have time to have another meeting, to plan for another meeting, to have another meeting. Because while we are fighting amongst ourselves, the raping and pillaging continues. It does not sleep. And coming from where I come from, where we're pulling fish from the water that have cancers hanging off of them, we're airlifting our babies to the urban medical centers for drinking contaminated water. We're getting boiled water advisories issued by Health Canada. These are issues in a first world country where the original peoples of that land are living in third world living conditions. So the solution is paying attention. Our elders, they tell us that we have one mouth and two ears for a reason. To listen more than we talk. And what that means here is educating ourselves on the collective issues, whether it be child and family services, violence against women, environmental degradation, war, whatever that means to you, etc., etc., etc. Education and humility is the key. Never be afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know. Educate me, guide me, and tell me what I can do. Then it is your job to create the connection, because somewhere along the way, we have failed natural law in that everything is connected. We cannot focus all of our time and energy in one campaign. We don't have that luxury anymore, because the truth of the matter is we are all facing the same issues. The foundation of all of the issues we face has always been development and the disease of greed. That's really fast.
It goes fast.
And the disease of greed that follows. Greed that has been informing human self-destructive behavior, creating the disconnect from nature, the laws of nature, empathy, and most importantly, ourselves. The creation of disassociation, which speaks of disconnection. And in case you missed the message, I want you to walk away knowing and being interconnectedness. And that sounds like a lot of work, but no one ever said that this would be easy. But our elders did say that it would be worth it. Because we have a Cree teaching that when you go about things in a good way with good intentions, no tawe nan, our Creator will never leave you vulnerable, but He will test you. So with that, I've done my part. Providing there should be a fact sheet somewhere on my nation and what we are doing to provide a solution. Many of us are collectively standing together and demanding environmental justice with the aim of understanding that there is a need to address and reduce the disproportionate harm from environmental degradation that affects Indigenous, low-income, and minority communities. People of color in frontline communities face environmental burdens from extreme resource extraction and exploitation. So we must begin to participate in processes designed by us to improve environmental health and safety. Indigenous peoples are exercising our rights and are standing up to protect the land, water, and our collective future, not only for ourselves, but for the very existence of the human race. and we are doing what we can to stop the exploitation and abuse of Mother Earth from one end of this country to the other, all over what we call Turtle Island and on a global level. Education on treaty people and the power we have within those agreements, and that of the assertion of our right to self-determination as a sovereign nation within a nation. From that, it is your responsibility to be a good ally to the original peoples of Turtle Island by A, educating yourselves on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and promoting it. Educating yourselves on treaty law within these invisible borders of Canada and the United States of America, whilst remembering that our treaties are the supreme law of these lands. In Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act and Article 6 of the United States Constitution, followed by the demand that your nation honor its treaty commitments because you too are treaty rights title holders. Remember that the winged, water, and land beings, including plants and minerals, are life, and they're your relatives, not resources to be exploited. Learn about the original peoples in your territories and build relationships with them. Live with gratitude and walk lightly on our Mother Earth, and consider the future generations in all that you do. Yes, it's that easy. Currently, people all over Turtle Island are working collectively. We have this thing back home, the Healing Walk, where no matter race, color, or creed, you can come there over one weekend where we have ceremony and honor our one true mother. The Cowboy and Indian Alliance that gathered in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, the Idle No More movement. So I'm gonna leave you with this, and it comes from the Lakota people. Honor those who came before us, meeting the needs of the present generations, not compromising the future so that the coming generations are able to meet their own needs and guide our vision and renew each cycle of life.
Thank you, Crystal. Our next speaker is Andy Clarno. Andy is, he teaches here at UIC in sociology and African American studies. His research looks at the role of neoliberal restructuring in the political transitions in both South Africa and Palestine. He's engaged very actively in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement and specifically the BDS movement, and he's going to really talk about the relationship between the sort of solidarity work that he did in South Africa and Palestine.
Right. Thanks, Lynette. Thanks, Barbara, for organizing this. Sorry, it is a real honor to be here, to be part of this gathering today. Has been fantastic, and I look forward to continuing discussions. I'm going to speak about the transnational connections of the Palestinian struggle, and I'm going to try to make 4 quick points before my time runs out. So the first is that the Palestinian struggle has always had deep transnational connections and anti-imperialist links. In the 1920s and 30s, communities from Mali, African communities from Mali and Chad moved to Jerusalem to support the Palestinians and to protect the Al-Aqsa Mosque. By the 1960s and 70s, they were at the forefront of the leftist struggle, of leftist Palestinian solidarity movements, and the African Palestinian communities are still, to this day, there in Jerusalem and very active. In the 1960s and 70s, the Palestine Liberation Organization was closely connected with national liberation movements throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Arab world. Just a quick note, Che Guevara and Malcolm X both went to Palestine in the mid-1960s. By the 1980s, the Palestinian uprising, the Intifada, drew on the history of the black freedom struggle in the United States and the connections of nonviolent direct action. So that's the first point I want to make, is that long history. Second, I want to focus on 3 more recent movements that have been important over the last 15 years. The first is through international gatherings such as the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, and the World Social Forum, where Palestinian social movements have built connections with social movements throughout the world. The second is popular committees that have organized against the wall and working closely with the international solidarity movement have brought thousands of people from Europe and North America, as well as Africa and Latin America and Asia, to Palestine to take part in direct action against the occupation. And these movements have drawn explicitly on the Freedom Summer in the United States and actively read, literature from the struggles here in the United States, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And a lot of those folks have gone to Palestine and returned back to their communities where they're taking part in activism in their own communities. And the last that I want to spend a little bit more time speaking about is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is building on the South African struggle against apartheid, very consciously and actively. So to spend a little bit more time speaking about the BDS movement and why in some ways it has aspects that make it a really strong model for transnational solidarity work. It's a Palestinian-led movement. In 2005, Palestinian civil society organizations, political and social movements came together and put together a very strong call on the rest of the world to provide support to their struggle through organizing boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. In this call, they wrote that there's 3 principles on which the struggle is based, and this is really important, is they said that they're calling for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions until the occupation is over, the refugees have the right to return, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel have equality. Right? These are the 3 core aspects of the struggle set up by BDS. And there's 3 real strengths of this movement that I see. I mean, one, it instigates conversations and debates at multiple scales and multiple levels where people are engaged in discussions around Palestine. Second, it provides people with concrete possibilities for action, right? Organizing campaigns in their local communities. And third, it creates possibilities for connections to a broader struggles against corporate capitalism through campaigns that target corporations like Caterpillar, Veolia, and G4S. This movement has had a very impressive string of victories over the last several years. And as Israeli society turns more and more to the right, the country will be easier and easier to isolate. So there will be continuing victories. But looking forward, I want to kind of raise 2 cautionary notes. The first is that in South Africa, the boycott movement was closely tied through the National Liberation Movement to grassroots struggles on the ground, the labor movements, community organizations, and popular uprisings. And while in Palestine, there are very impressive popular and grassroots movements, there's a lot of work happening there. It's very impressive what's going on, but the movements themselves are weak and fragmented. They face tremendous repression, not only from the state of Israel, but from Palestinian Authority security forces that are trained by the United States in Jordan. And the Palestinian social movements have also been disrupted and disorganized by the tremendous presence of non-governmental organizations that are stripping away the energy. So the conditions on the ground are very dangerous right now. And while there's tremendous success internationally, there's great danger on the ground that as Israel becomes further and further to the right, the possibilities of what they will do to Palestinians are quite frightening. And so there's a big question moving forward is what role transnational solidarity movements can play in supporting movement building on the ground in a place like Palestine. And the last point tied to that is that while the Palestinian BDS movement has really done an impressive job of building on the successes of the South African struggle against apartheid, and it was a tremendous success, brought down a powerful apartheid regime, it's also important to keep in mind the limitations of liberation in South Africa, where the struggle against racism was separated from the struggle against capitalism, and the capitalist system was left in place simply creating space for the emergence of a black elite alongside the old white elite, where the vast majority of black people still live in tremendous poverty. So there should be a warning there for the Palestinians, I think, to keep in mind the importance of capitalism and organizing against neoliberalism, which hasn't played a very important role in the BDS movement to this point. So I just want to, point to the tremendous success of the BDS movement and hope that as the movement moves forward, it will begin to grapple more with some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. And our final speaker, last but not least, is Lisa Brock. Lisa is the academic director of the Arcus Center for Social Justice and Leadership in Kalamazoo. She's a longtime anti-apartheid activist, was involved here in Chicago in particular, as well as doing solidarity work for many years with Cuba. She's the author of Between Race and Empire, African Americans and Cubans Before the Cuban Revolution, and I'm going to leave it here and let you talk.
Okay. Thank you, Lynette. And I'd like to introduce my co-author of that book, Profesora Digna Castañeda. Stand up, Digna. And it's an example of solidarity work, I think, if you in fact are a scholar and you work in solidarity with people to engage in the kind of work that is collaborative. I think it's very important. And so Digna and I, we were studying the relationship between African Americans and Cubans, and we decided to do what we were studying, and that is to create a relationship. I'm going to be very brief as everybody else was, in talking about, I want to just raise a few points. We have a very short amount of time, and if people have questions, they can ask me as we move forward. I just first have to really echo what Andy said about the issue of capitalism and liberation movements. For those of us who were in the anti-apartheid movement, we did not think, dream, or hope that what has happened in South Africa economically would have happened. So your cautionary tale about the BDS movement is really, really important. You really, because global power is always working 24/7, and so we have to as well. So these are my comments. One of the things that Barbara and Lynette asked us to respond to is what is freedom in the context of this conference, in the context of our solidarity work. So I thought I would first pose what freedom has meant to Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. Freedom in Cuba with the Cuban Revolution has been defined by putting the people first and meeting the basic needs of all the people. That was what freedom meant for the Cuban Revolution and still does by and large. Therefore, food, healthcare, primary, secondary, and higher education are available and free to all with little to no discrimination based on class, race, or gender. Because of this, according to World Health Organization statistics, Cubans have a longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality rate, and highest literacy rate in all the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. And they rank higher in these life chance statistics than most Black American communities in the United States. And I'll just give you an example of when you say put the people first. Sometimes it's really hard, I think, for people in this country to wrap their minds around that. There was a big hurricane in Pinar del Rio in 2008, which is an area in the western part of Cuba. And the hurricane watchers in Cuba are some of the best in the world, even though they don't have all the sophisticated equipment that the US has, but they put people first. The hurricane's coming, they successfully evacuate over 60,000 people. They take stoves, they take animals, they put in trains, people fill up the trains, they fill up the trucks, and people are evacuated. In all of Cuba's hurricanes over the last few years, very few people, under 10, have died. Think about what it would meant if we put people first with Katrina. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there. So it's interesting. I made my first, I should say though that Cuba is not a panacea. Racism and sexism have not been eradicated, and economic challenges have meant that the spreading of the resources for the people have at various times been very thin. The special period was one such epic That is, after the socialist world collapsed, Cuba lost its major trading partners. And so a lot of the resources were very thin. People often ask me why I got interested in Cuba and why Cuba. I'm like, why not? After working on anti-racism in the U.S. as a young person and then working in solidarity with the liberation struggle in South Africa, I actually visited Cuba in 1986 and was just so overwhelmed by some of the things that I saw. And so I chose to do solidarity work and to do scholarship on Cuba, largely because I think it's important for us to study really what is the only remaining successful socialist country in this hemisphere. And it's a country that is multiracial, has a slave past, and had the nerve to engage in international solidarity with Africa and Latin America. So I am interested in like what debates, what questions led them to this kind of policy? How have they actually managed to not be successfully invaded by the United States? What are there ideological foundations that have created this kind of unity on such a small island? I mean, we can think about Grenada, we can think about the Honduras, we can think about Panama, all these places that the U.S. has invaded. They have not been able to do that in Cuba. I think we need to study why that happened and how that happened. Just a couple more things. I just wanted to outline what I think are the three major areas of solidarity work today in terms of Cuba. One is we have to continue to fight the 53-year-old U.S. blockade against Cuba. The United States has blocked all trade and has worked through the Congress and the Senate to force other countries to not trade with Cuba. This has been particularly harmful for Cuba because the U.S. is 90 miles away from Cuba and they had been a historic trading partner. And so if Cuba was able to trade with the United States, we have no idea what they would have been able to do with this socialist experiment. So we need to end that blockade and support Cuban self-determination and sovereignty. Two, we have to support the release of the 3 remaining Cuban 5 who are here languishing in the United States jails. These Cuban men were actually working in Miami to uncover activities against the Cuban government. So they were anti-terrorist activists in the United States, and they were jailed. They are in jail, convicted and jailed to lifetime sentences in the United States. And the third major area is to support Cuba's legal right internationally to host Assata Shakur as a political exile. Cuba has a right to do that. I mean, if you think about it, Assata Shakur is there. She got official political exile because she had been targeted in this country as a political activist and as a member of the Black Panther Party. According to international law, every country has a right to give political asylum based on their own criteria. If, in fact, countries decide that they want to go and snatch people from another country because they've been given political exile, chaos and havoc would reign. Because there are people in this country, 2 of them actually might be our former president and vice president, George Bush. And who was the guy that was his vice president? Cheney. They are wanted as war criminals in other parts of the world.
Most of the world.
Most of the world. So only international law is protecting them, and Cuba should have the right to do that as well. Also putting Assata Shakur on the international terrorist watch list does, I think, what Nadine is talking about, or reveals what Nadine is talking about how there is this connection between the war on crime, the war on drugs, and the war on terror. And by designating Assata Shakur a terrorist, they are increasingly trying to create a discourse where those lines are blurred. And we all can be victims of it, whether we're here, whether we're in Palestine, or anywhere in the world. And then just finally, you know, there are a lot of young people in the audience, and as a person who's a director of a Center for Social Justice, young people often want to know, well, tell me how to do solidarity work right, how to do it the best way. And so I'd just like to offer some suggestions to the young people and maybe some of the older folks.
Lisa. You have like a few seconds.
Okay, okay. Everybody else went over a little bit.
But we don't have time for discussion.
Okay, all right. Okay, so this is it. So one, if you want to engage in transnational solidarity, study, listen, engage. Two, know which side or sides you are on. For instance, in terms of Cuba, there are those who think the Cuban Revolution was bad and some decent things came out of it. I think the Cuban Revolution was good and some contradictions and challenges came out of it. So I know what side I'm on. If you don't know what side you're on, which is why you need to study, listen, engage, you can really be used and manipulated. Three, build trust, meaningful relationships with people, with individuals. The things you learn around a kitchen table are indispensable. Four, share risk.
Lisa.
I'm almost.
Okay, we just won't have any time for questions.
Okay.
You can just list it really quickly.
It's just two more.
Okay, quickly.
Okay. Share risk and the hardships. People in struggle will never forget that. Center the voices of those you are working with in solidarity because they know more than you about the struggle that they are engaged in, but be prepared to be thoughtful in debate and disagreements. Following blindly or leading arrogantly is not good solidarity work.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take 10 minutes. A minute? He said I could take.
That's what I get.
Okay, 10 minutes for questions. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but I just think it's really important for us to have a little exchange. So why don't we take the questions?